What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, I am recording this off my laptop because I am moving right now, so hopefully there's no real degradation in terms of quality. So we are picking up with Damage. Really, the second volume of Damage is really what this is. It's kind of interesting. So for those of you guys who are new to comic books overall, usually when it comes to introducing a character, it'll only ever happen in one of two ways. Either it'll happen in terms of them like appearing as a backup feature or part of a main story. The other thing is that usually they just kind of do like a mini series, right? Like they'll really kind of like a short volume. They'll say, okay, we're gonna write like 6 issues, and then we're gonna test the waters with these 6 issues, and we're gonna see what happens. Now, in modern days, Marvel just cancels after 6 issues instead of changing up writers, which is what they used to do, which is why so many of the stories, really kind of had a lot more of a dynamic than they do right now. A lot of them seem really two-dimensional. But DC is really kind of always kind of continue that trend. It's kind of weird here. But with regards to Damage, that's what we had. The first 3 issues were the introduction to his character, but we didn't really know his origin. We just kind of knew he was there and he was a byproduct of an experiment. What this does is it kind of expands on the first 3 issues and then really sort of builds up on his character. And that's kind of the cool thing here is it's really being taken at like a slow pace, right? Like it's really being taken in an exceedingly slow way in the sense that it's designed to just kind of go through and give us like this really basic idea of who this character is. Damage had basically escaped and he had fought Wonder Woman. And that was really kind of like the cool moment, kind of blasting onto the scene, fights Wonder Woman, is able to hold his own. And that was kind of the big moment for his character. But from here, what we end up doing is shifting out to a plantation of sorts where you basically have like, immigrant workers working. And this basically leads to like Poison Ivy kind of busting up on the scene. Now, this is kind of the cool thing because what's happening with Poison Ivy is actually tying into the Batman comics. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. But again, it really just kind of picks up with the actual origin of Ethan himself, with Ethan Avery. Now, this is a cool thing because in a lot of ways, the origin of Damage is very reminiscent of a combination of origins from both Marvel and DC. And when I say this, I mean like the Incredible Hulk, Bane as an example. There's a lot of kind of experimentation in terms of rolling this all together and seeing how it all works. And what we already knew was that Ethan Avery was basically a test subject. He was a guy who was kind of brought in for the purpose of being part of this quote unquote Damage program. Now, with this whole thing, it's designed to draw on a lot of these different elements, but that's the thing here. If you guys are looking at the new age of heroes, it's basically DC sitting down and saying, okay, fans at Marvel Comics want this particular thing, but if Marvel won't do it, we will, and we'll just steal their audience, which is exactly what they're doing. And it's actually working incredibly well. Like it's a really, really smart maneuver by DC to just siphon off the audience from Marvel Comics. With that whole thing, again, it's basically this idea that he was just kind of forced into it. But Ethan Avery is the first successful test subject of the Damage protocol. Following the whole incident with Wonder Woman and really his escape from the facility, he's basically been on the run. That's really the whole thing. He's just kind of been out there trying to stay under the radar and keep away from like these various, members of the various members of the military community that are trying to seize control of him. More specifically, Colonel Jonas. Now, again, it's almost like this is kind of like Ethan's own Thunderbolt Ross. So again, you see a lot of these themes sort of thrown in to the story that are brought to bear from a lot of the publications that have been released so far. But ultimately, what ends up happening here is he finds himself running or really kind of stowing away aboard a guy's truck. And then the guy simply says, look, if you're trying to get away and get under the radar, I've got a place where you can earn some money and then just kind of work there for a little while and then eventually, find passage somewhere else to wherever it is that you're looking to go. It'll keep you away from Colonel Jonas, because for Ethan Avery, no matter where he goes, he will be found. Like Colonel Jonas will locate him. And the reason why is because she's got a multitude of metahumans at her disposal, her own strike force more or less, which again is really kind of reminiscent of like the old Nick Fury. But still, one of these is somebody named Misha. And Misha has the ability to basically track people, to kind of pick up senses, to essentially, to basically say, I can detect where they're going, where they've been. And it's really cool here because it's almost like a sort of tactile ability to recognize where a person's going and what they're doing. In this case, one of the things she says is that like a person who had basically committed an assassination had stepped on flour, and she was able to locate where this person, like where they stepped on the flour, and then like all the way back to where they were hiding over the course of 3 months after the assassination had happened. So it was a pretty cool thing, like a pretty big moment here. But still, when you're dealing with this whole thing, it's basically, Jonas just trying to track him down. It's really all it is. And that's kind of really in this story, I'd say it's more of a background thing. It's not really as prominent as it was in the first 3 issues. It's just the idea that Ethan's on the run from the feds. That's really kind of what this means in terms of how the story's being told. The problem with this is that when the various workers alongside Ethan arrive to this plantation, there's just forests growing everywhere. There's trees all over the place. And we end up finding out the person who did this is Poison Ivy. Now again, it's kind of to be expected, right? And that's why this works so well, is there's a totally different reason why Poison Ivy's doing this from what we would expect, in the sense that normally her motivation is people are bad, plants are good. She's like the ultimate environmentalist. And so with this whole thing happening, it's like this idea that we would expect her to just kind of show up and say, you've been hurting trees, you know, and then punish humanity because they weren't hugging trees or something like that. This is exactly what we would expect. She just starts attacking people, using various plants at her disposal, emitting pheromones, different things like that, but she hasn't met Damage yet. And that's the funny situation, is we would expect Damage to immediately be able to overtake this, but that's not the case. And that's really one of the first big differences between Damage and the Incredible Hulk, because a lot of people have kind of been making this comparison, which they really are designed to be. I mean, Damage is very much akin to like Gray Hulk or Red Hulk or the Incredible Hulk himself. He's very similar to those different versions, but really when you get down to it, in terms of like the subtle differences, the ability for Damage to be infected by pheromones, that's a huge difference. And the reason why isn't really direct. Myself and Sal over Comic Pop were talking about this, and because the question we had here is, can the Purple Man make the Incredible Hulk kill Avengers? And the idea was, well, he gives off pheromones, so can the Incredible Hulk's healing factor override the pheromones of the Purple Man? And the only real argument we could come to was presented when Spider-Woman tried to use her powers, her ability to kind of make people fall in love with her, when she tried to use her powers on Wolverine, and it made him dizzy. So that was probably like the extent of it. With regards to this situation, if this was the Incredible Hulk, it might work for a minute, but then like he would basically, brush it off and then just like go crazy on Poison Ivy and just probably just start beating her to a pulp. With Damage, it's not that way. He's susceptible to these kind of things. It's basically saying that like if he's exposed to something that could basically override his various senses, then you could basically take him out. So he's not completely invulnerable. And so from here, what we end up doing when he's basically knocked out and then taken by Poison Ivy, we kind of get this memory flashback, and we're basically shown this kind of this basically initial controlled test to see what it is that he's capable of. Now, this is a pretty big deal, and the reason why is because what they end up saying is the entire Damage formula is actually derived from something called Miraclo, which is actually really a derivative of the old Rex Tyler comics, or really not really Rex Tyler comics, but the old like All-Star comics. I think it was like either it was All-American or All-Star number 38 back in 1940, but it's basically where Our Man comes from. And this was a really cool idea, and it's actually pretty awesome because what it does is it invokes like these long lost themes of DC Comics that basically like the legacy of members of the Justice Society of America continue to live on. Our Man was a guy from way back in the day where he could basically ingest Miraclo and then essentially receive like enhanced vitality and enhanced strength, but only for an hour. And then he had to have a recovery time of like 23 hours or something like that. And with this whole concept is basically built on that. It's essentially saying like, we're taking this concept of Our Man, we have no idea where Our Man is, but we're taking this concept of Rex Tyler, we're gonna build on it, and then we're gonna create a weapon out of it. And that's how Damage gets his power. That's why you have the 1 hour limit, is because for whatever reason, he can't go any more than an hour. Now, the speculative explanation that's given to us here is that it's because of the limits of the human body, that when a person undergoes this transformation, you're talking about pushing the muscles and strength and all that kind of stuff all to the physical extreme. And so if it were to go on for longer than an hour, we don't really know what the effect would be. We don't know if the body wouldn't be able to handle it anymore, the heart would give out. We don't know if Damage would start to deteriorate on the cellular level. We have no clue what would happen. But that's kind of a cool thing here. And the reason why is because I have a hard time imagining that DC wants to kind of retread water with Our Man. And so I could see them saying this is like a short-term limitation. And the reason why I say that's possible is because if you're looking through this, you basically have, Ethan Avery talking to Damage and Damage talking back. So they're two distinctly different personalities. It's not like the Incredible Hulk where, Bruce Banner doesn't really know what the Hulk does. Hulk doesn't really know what Bruce Banner does, depending on, which one's in control. It's really more akin to like the kind of, Lee Price Venom scenario, in the sense of like the Venom symbiote talked to Lee Price and Lee Price talked to the Venom symbiote. So that's really kind of how this thing works out. And it's actually pretty effective. At this point we pick up with Ethan himself when he's basically met by one of the guys and they say, hey, look, I saw you transform and you can basically help us. The problem with this is, again, it takes like 23 hours to basically allow that to happen. And the reason why is because he has to build his energy back up. Now, one of the things that happens here is this does not take place over the course of 23 hours. Instead, he's actually fed some basically sugarcane by this guy who simply says, hey, look, consume this stuff and then you'll be fine. After which he basically starts reverting back into Damage. He's able to become Damage again. So again, it ties into this idea that he doesn't really have to have a 23-hour limit. That is really just like a huge amount of energy that's sapped from him. But what we end up finding out here is that Poison Ivy is not just her. Instead, Poison Ivy is actually working directly with Gorilla Grodd, which is kind of cool, but also kind of weird at the same time. Now, if I were a betting man, I would say the reason why this is the case is because it allows DC to give Damage this kind of tour of the DC villain universe, the real heavy hitters, like the powerful guys. I mean, with someone like Poison Ivy, she's not powerful in and of herself. It's her ability to tap into the green, and it's her ability to basically manipulate plant life that makes her so powerful. But someone like Gorilla Grodd, I mean, he has the ability to dominate the minds of other people. And so it's a way to kind of round out Damage himself and then basically fast track it. You know, he's obviously has a weakness to various pheromones and things like that are put off by Poison Ivy, but then it becomes Gorilla Grodd. How powerful is Damage in comparison to somebody who has like telepathy, who can dominate the minds of others? Well, the idea here is that he's basically powerless. There really isn't a whole lot he can do to stop Gorilla Grodd, because where he starts going on this rampage and tearing up the tearing up the forces of Gorilla Grodd, as soon as Grodd seizes control of Damage, he immediately stops. Like, he can't move. And so that's kind of the cool thing here. There are limitations to what his character can and can't do. They're basically saying, like, we do not want to have to write this character for 30 years and then find out that we can't make good stories about him anymore because we've basically done everything that can be told. Like, we want longevity. The other side of this is that where you have Grodd, who really is kind of controlling Damage, you end up having Poison Ivy, who sort of clicks out of it. She basically snaps out of whatever's controlling her and then essentially turns on Grodd. And then from there, like, Grodd essentially releases Damage, and then Damage starts to go on a warpath and then, basically starts to tear Grodd up. But it's kind of a cool thing, is because Damage was gonna kill Grodd. When you have a situation like this, like, what this shows is that, like, Damage will kill. Like, he'll kill anybody. Like, he'll kill people who get in the way. He'll just destroy them if he can, if it means that, like, he can keep them from coming after him. And so his intention is to destroy Grodd entirely. But ultimately, Poison Ivy kind of talks him down and says, hey, look, you gotta stop. And then from there, Poison Ivy just kind of like walks away. She's just kind of like, look, I'm no longer under the influence of what was controlling me. Everything's cool. You guys, everybody relax. I'm getting out of here. You guys go back to doing your thing. I'll see you when I see you. And that's that's basically it, with her little tidbit here. Now, the explanation of what's actually going on behind the scenes, and this is why this is so cool, is you pick up, about 24 hours later after Ethan Avery wakes up, and he's met by Swamp Thing. Now, this is kind of a cool thing, because Swamp Thing is kind of like the old man Forrest, right? Like, Swamp Thing's been around forever. And he starts talking to Ethan, and he's like, look, man, like, I recognize the situation that you're in, right? Like, I mean, one part of you is a monster, one part of you is a regular guy, and that's fine, but even monsters can do good things. It's all a matter of what your intention is, like what you're trying to achieve. It could very well be that because Damage isn't controllable, the best way to mitigate destruction and the best way to use Damage for good is to drop him into really terrible and dangerous situations so that he can fight the fights that nobody else can. So there's ways to make that work. But the other thing about this is that Swamp Thing basically says there's this kind of civil war among the green in DC Comics. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, the green is essentially nature. That's really what it is. It's trees, it's plants, any form of a tree, bush, plant, anything like that. That's all tied into the green. And what Swamp Thing essentially says here is that Swamp Thing has always been kind of a caretaker, more like a peaceful being. If he's provoked, then woe betide you. But for the most part, he's just kind of a guy who likes to keep the peace. The problem with this is that the green kind of looks at the world around them and sees, the progression of humanity and industrialization and says, look, they're basically tearing everything up. So the only way to fix this problem is to destroy humanity. And that's what the green wants to do. The green wants to use Swamp Thing for the purpose of destroying humanity. Well, Swamp Thing's not having any of it. And so in turn, the green turned his attention to Poison Ivy and began kind of molding Poison Ivy into this kind of soldier, this sort of avatar that will essentially lead a war against the world and basically recreate M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening. But still, like with this whole situation, it is kind of cool. It is pretty interesting watching this whole thing unfold. I couldn't help but laugh myself when I saw that movie. That movie was ass. It really was. It was bad. That movie was terrible. M. Night Shyamalan. Oh, I thought it almost destroyed his career. But anyway, this works because it kind of shows that, like, there are other things going on in the DC universe. It's slowly introducing him into the larger DC landscape to give people an idea of what his character is about, what his strengths and weaknesses are. And then in turn, once he does face off against those bigger characters, point them back to this when they can essentially get like the whole explanation of what's really going on. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.